Well, Dr. Danisha Keating, it is so great to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Don't you love having doctor in the front of your name? I know that's like...
It's weird and cool and awkward at the same time just because I'm not used to it yet. I've only had it for like a year. So
Yeah.
it's like when you get, well, as a female, you get married, your name changes, and it's kind of that like, oh wait, no, it's not that, it's this now. That's how it feels.
Yep.
But it's also different just because, people do put you up a little bit higher now because they're like, oh wait, it's doctor. And I'm like,
Right.
I'm still me, but yeah, cool.
Right.
So it feels lots of feelings.
It's such an amazing accomplishment in and of itself. And then as our listeners are going to hear with your story, it's even more incredible. But I'm like, man, one day I want to hear Dr. David Blackburn. I feel like I'd have to drop my nickname on that one. It wouldn't be Davey anymore if I was a doctor. I feel like, I don't know. Somehow I'd have to drop that, but
you could go by Dr. Davey. I feel like that would work.
Dr. Maybe it would stick. We'll see.
It will stick.
We'll see. Well, Danisha, you have an incredible story. I mean, as I've just been kind of doing a little bit of research and just seeing how far God has brought you, it is a unique story. It is powerful. And now you're doing something that is, we always talk about pain to purpose, seeing people go from pain to purpose. And you really are turning your pain around into some significant purpose. In fact, if you're watching this on YouTube, guys, she's in a hotel room because she has been sharing her story at other events and stuff. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's what I want to do. I want you to tell us a little bit about your life right now, what you do, and then we're going to dive back and hear your story, because the fact that you are here where you are right now doing what you're doing is an absolute miracle and a testament to God's grace. So tell us what you do, and then we'll dive back and listen to your story.
So right now I'm getting to run around California to different foster care groups that are within colleges, high schools, counties, and talk about what it was like being a foster care kid, but also a foster care kid navigating education. So a part of that is also sitting with these kids afterwards and sitting with parents and talking about the hard stuff of what foster care is. Some people will think, well, the foster care happened because of the teenager or the child. And that for some reason is a really big stigma, but it's not the kid's inability to do something. It was actually the parents. And so there's a lot of shame that comes in with this community. So being able to come in and shine light and healing just makes people go, okay, I can change my life. I don't have to repeat generational cycles.
Yeah.
But it is a group of people that are often missed and walked away from by some people. So it's been a journey to do that.
Wow. Well, obviously this passion has come out of your own experience in the foster care system. Can you, and not just that, but so much else that you walked through while you were in the foster care system. Can you just dive back, just whatever you would kind of deem the starting point of your story, the significant components of your story, and just kind of narrate for us. Just talk to us about your life growing up.
So I think a lot of the times I usually start and I'm like, well, in high school, and I start to remember it wasn't just high school that we were dealing with CPS and foster care. It was actually way before that. I think the first time I remember meeting a CPS worker, I was 8. My mom actually grew up in the foster care system. Both sides of my family have dealt with CPS, I think, my entire life. And it's one of those things that the best way to describe it is just someone always coming and lingering over you to say, don't mess up. And so growing up with that, understanding that if we messed up, it was our fault that we were taken away. Like somehow we failed as a child. And so I remember at 13, the CPS worker came in. We were homeschooled from pre-K to that point. They said, you can't be homeschooled. You have to be in public school because you can't be home alone. I'm one of 11 kids, and so I'm the 4th oldest. And when I was turning 15, they were like, okay, from 13 to 15, they're like, you got to put them in school. You got to put them in school. And they came back and said, look, you have a choice. We either take them from you, from the parent, or we put them in school. And so my mom finally made the decision, okay, let's go enroll them. And we got into education institute, like public education for the first time. And that was a whirlwind because when you're not being educated, there are homeschooling groups that are amazing. And there's homeschooling parents that are amazing. My parents stopped teaching us. They were just like, there's no point.
Mm,
For the girls, it was, why am I teaching you anything but home ec and baby raising? Like, you don't need to be taught. So any education we did get was ourselves. Like, we were just looking through books,
mm.
reading things, trying to figure it out. But I had already been delayed in a lot of different things educationally. I learned to read when I was 9. I had dyslexia that I didn't know about until I was in high school. I was like, oh my gosh.
Wow.
But it was things that I remember just sitting there and being like, I got this. And CPS being like, no, you don't have this. You're 13. You can't have this. You can't raise a 6-month-old and
Wow.
take them and do their school and then do your school. Like, you're not the mom. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, this is our role. This is our job. So when we were entered into high
Wow.
school, it was March of the freshman year, and the school year ended in June at that point. And the high school counselor I went to, he's like, I'm not helping you. I'm not wasting my time on you. I just don't help people. Like, he just said, I don't help your kind, meaning statistics. Like, he doesn't help people who
Wow.
aren't AP and honor students. And that's verbatim what he said. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. But later found out
Wow.
from a friend who's like, this is how we navigate this. Let's go talk to this teacher. And I was like, okay. And I talked to that teacher and she showed me, she's like, you're 20 credits behind. And your teacher or your counselor did call all of your teachers to let them know you need to be failed, because there's no point in passing you at this point. And it was like every single conversation I would have was like, you're not making it. We're not helping you. And that was emotionally difficult
Man.
because you're just like, no one wants to believe in me. And like, there's just these issues.
Right.
But then in my sophomore year, um, I was coming home from a band camp thing. I was for a color guard competition we had in the fall. And that is when CPS picked us up and was like, hey, we're moving the 8 of you that are under the age of 18 to 3 different homes. And that's when my older sister and my brother-in-law, who had been married for about a year, they were like, we're going to step in and step up the best way we can. And they took us all into an apartment a couple weeks after we were put into the system, but I aged out of the system. And so what that means for people who might not know is there's 2 ages depending on where your state is. So it's either 18 or 21. Some kids can petition to stay in the foster care system until 21, as long as they have
Yeah.
housing and all of that stuff. My CPS worker was like, by the way, you're done. You're out. We're not going to have you stay with your sister anymore because the room she has you in is with your sister who's under the age of 18. And that can't happen. So you got to go. So I was immediately homeless my senior
Wow.
year. And I was like, okay. So again, one of
Wow.
these moments where you just feel like you're thrown to the side. Um,
Yeah.
and there's this feeling that you get, and that it used to be a big feeling for me was you're replaceable. Nobody cares about you. You
Yeah.
literally I remember a coach saying it like, I can replace you like that. And I was like, yeah, I know. And other people would be crying and I'm like, get over it. Like, we're all replaceable. That's just life. And I just took that as like, it's true. I'm invisible and replaceable. And
Yeah.
that's fine. So when I graduated high school, I lived in my car for a full year, homeless, and from 19 to 24 would bounce around from house to house. I had over 30 different addresses, which was insane to me. And that was just the stuff I registered
Wow.
for. Like, I had to change. And then I got a P.O. box because I was like, I'm tired of changing my address and losing mail,
Yeah.
which is kind of funny because you're like, it's weird. Your identity is kind of shaken at that point. So a piece of luggage or a blanket is what you hold on to versus like other people will hold on to like pictures or letters or notes. It's
Mhm.
just kind of weird when you're in the foster care system and you're moving around so much, you lose so much. You learn to condense what you live in and what you have to boxes or bags or suitcases. So when that happened, and I was bouncing around, I was like, I'm tired of this. I want to change my life. And I enrolled back into college. Got in, failed my first semester, which I was like, well, that happens. Another win for me. Um, which it hits you differently when you fail
Yeah.
so much that you're just like, I can't accomplish anything. There's nothing I can do.
Yeah.
And there were so many times I would tell myself, like, I'm good at one thing, and if I try anything else, it fails. So education was something I'm
Yeah.
like, I could do this. It's just I have to try a lot harder. And one of my professors said something, it was very, just like, I share this with everyone because it's so profound, where you're just like, okay. So he asked the class, he's like, if you woke up in 10 years from now, would you be happy with the choices that you made? Not where you end up in
Hmm.
life or what your life looks like, but would you be happy with the choices that you made? And I
Interesting.
sat
Yeah.
back and I was like, huh, little 19-year-old me kind of
Yeah.
like, okay, no, I might not be happy with where I'm at, but am I happy with those choices that I make now and how they impact
Hmm.
tomorrow? And I started making choices to be happy about. Um, and
Yeah.
at 24, one of those choices was when I got a call from two of my brothers who were running away from home, my dad's house. And they said, we need you to come pick us up. And I was like, okay, I finally got my own apartment. It was a 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, 500 square foot. And I'm like, that's enough for one person. And then they called and needed a place to stay. So I was like, okay, yeah, 3 people can be here. We're good.
Wow.
We got this. You know, it's not 500 square feet's not that bad for 3 people. And then a few months
Yeah.
later, I get another call to pick up my three youngest siblings, who at that time were 12, 14, and 15. I was 24
Goodness.
years
Wow.
old. So I wasn't making a lot of money,
Jeez.
still trying to finish my bachelor's. And it was either pick them up and figure it out or have them go back to foster care. And the hard part is with foster
Wow.
care, with siblings, they're normally split up. It's very rare to find a home that can take all three. And I was like, we're just going to figure this out. And this is where I started to really notice God was like, okay, I got you. And there was something
Hmm.
like I was praying on it, and there was like maybe a week before it actually like happened. That I was like, I knew it was going to happen before it happened, basically. And then that's when I got the
Right.
call. But I was praying on it, and I just kept hearing God say, like, I will take care of you. I will take care of you. And I'm just like, okay. And when you hear that, sometimes you're like, okay, God, you're going to like bring out Ellen DeGeneres with all of this stuff, and she's going to hear our story and give us all of these things. And that doesn't happen
Mm.
often. So I pick my siblings up, I get the court documents done, and literally overnight, I'm a guardian to these kids. And I'm enrolling them in school. And 24-year-old little girl freaking out emotionally because it's just like this is a big responsibility. And the hard part is
Right.
on one side, you have some people saying, you know what, you've got this, let's help you, we'll figure it out together. And then other
Yeah.
people being like, you're ruining them, you're ruining yourself. What about this person? What about that person? What about your parents? And I'm like, this is why we're in this situation.
Yeah.
So you really hear a lot of different things, and it reminds me of the story of Job, where Job is sitting there and
Mm.
his friends are like,
Yep.
"We're with you," and then they're against him, and then they're like, "Well, you did something," and you're just like,
Yep.
"Go away, go away."
Yep. Yep.
So
Wow.
lo and behold, now I'm a guardian of 3 kids and then two little teen adults who are still trying to figure it out,
Yeah.
getting them driver's license, trying to help them get jobs, and just kind of like, oh my gosh, while still going to court against my dad and being in his trial and trying to handle the emotions of my mom and then my own emotions. But we're all in this 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, 500 square foot apartment. And a lot of people listening will be like, well, why did CPS let you have them if it was such a small place with six
Mm.
people? That's a lot. Our CPS worker had said, you know what? The houses, they're just overwhelmed. Foster care, it's hard to find placements, and it won't be within the same city.
Yeah.
They might be spread out between cities and even states. We just don't know. And
Wow.
she's like, what we could do is we can designate where they're, I just need to know where they're staying. And I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the boys' room is the living room. The girls' room is the bedroom, but I can't be in there because I'm over the age of 18. I'm going to be in
Right.
the walk-in closet. That's a bedroom. And so that's how she wrote it down.
Wow.
3 bedroom apartment. And I'm like, that was a God thing where she was just like, look, we get how bad this is. And the hard part is a lot of
Wow.
foster care teenagers have a hard time getting placed. A lot of people want little kids. It's hard
Mm.
to have teenagers. There's a lot of, they're
Yeah.
already adults at that point, and they're kind of like on their
Right.
own. And so people will be like, oh, it's too hard. I don't want them. And so that's the
Yeah.
reality that they face. And she was like, I'd rather keep them together with you guys than have them hurt even more.
Mm.
And a lot of people are like, oh, well, you probably got a lot of money assistance. And no, not with guardianship.
Mm.
Guardianship and kinship is different than foster care licensed parents. When it's a guardianship and a kinship, there's not a lot of funding there. And so for the three kids, every month the state was only helping with $680 a month.
Wow.
And
Wow.
that was like, oh, and
Yeah.
uh, that was just kind of mind blowing because I was like, oh, that's not a lot. But in my head, I'm like, I'll make it work. We're just going to do what we got to
Yeah.
do. And so
Yeah.
at that point, my church community was just like, okay, we're going to help you. They put me in contact with a lawyer who attended the church. So she was guiding me for free through all of the processes I needed to do. She's like, you need to get this done. You need to get that done. You have to get your mom signed off on this. You have to do this, 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 and this. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, but I did exactly what she said. And then another person from the church found us a 4-bedroom townhome that was with an income, like they have like low income studios and things like that. So they found a low
Yeah.
income townhome and we got moved into there after 9 months of being in a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom, which is
Wow.
a long time. And they helped us move in. And then the church is like, okay, what do you need furniture wise? What do you need clothes wise, shoes wise, food,
Yeah.
dishes, whatever it is. And I didn't realize it until I did my taxes, just how much the church community had helped.
Mm.
So that year I made $18,000. That's very, very low, especially for
Yeah.
a family of 6. But
Yeah.
when I looked back, because I was very confused when I did my taxes, because I was like,
Mhm.
I know I made more than that, or I had more money than that. So I went
Yeah.
back to my bank account and there was, I think, over like $30,000 extra that came in outside of what I made from people
Wow.
donating money. And then when
Right.
I went around
Right.
the house, every kid had a bed, every kid had a dresser, every kid had clothes. It didn't matter if they were,
Man.
young adults or teenager. People were like, "Here you go," which was crazy. People
Wow.
made sure we had cars. They're like, "Hey, I know your car's on the limb. Here's another one." And I'm like, "Oh my goodness, like this is insane." And the power of community is so big. Yes, there's negativity that can
Yeah.
come from that where people are like just super judgmental. But there were so many people who were like, don't listen to that voice. And I was like, okay.
Wow.
And in the midst of all of this, I'm trying to finish my bachelor's degree. So it took me 8 years to finally finish. And several parents were like, you need to drop out, you need to focus on the kids. And one mom heard it and she came like during church and she just like grabbed me and she's like, don't you dare quit. You've worked
Oh,
way too
wow.
hard and you need to stay this. She's like, you have to finish this. I feel like I need to tell you that. And I was like, I wasn't
Mm.
planning on quitting, but thank you. Like the judgment is
Wow.
real. And I
Yeah.
think it's
Yeah.
just when we go into panic mode, we tend to go into panic mode. And people are like,
Yeah.
here's the advice you need to do right now. And it's like, oh my gosh. So I finished my bachelor's, finished it in 8 years, went on to my master's, finished that in a year. The difference between getting into my master's, though, it was a struggle because I didn't have the GPA that I needed. I needed a 3.0. I had a 2.8. And one of the counselors I was working with, he's like, you can petition, right? Like you can petition to get into the program. And your
Mm.
story makes sense to me of why your GPA was 2.8. He goes, I can literally see the dip in your grades when everything went
Mm.
down. And so I was like, okay. So he's like,
Wow.
write your story out. They need to know that you're a good student. You just
Mm.
have life hit you really hard. So I wrote it, got
Mm.
into the program, and finished my master's in a year, and then entered into my PhD program,
Wow.
and was able to finish that in 3.5 years. Nationally, it's actually 5 to 7 years to finish that degree, and I was able to do it in
Mm.
3.5. But there's still that not
Jeez.
because I'm still like, I got to get to the next thing. I haven't been able to really
Yeah.
sit there and be like, oh, that's a really big accomplishment. But
Yeah.
then you look at
Right.
the statistics for foster care and education, and it's 50% don't graduate high school nationally.
Yeah.
Only 3% nationally are graduating with an associate's or a bachelor's degree. So once they
Mm.
do that, they're like, oh my gosh, that's unheard of. And then you go
Yeah.
to a master's and a PhD, it's almost unheard of where it's impossible. And nationally, with
Right.
a PhD degree, it's 2% of the nation among the general population.
Right.
Like
Right.
it's a very rare thing to have. And so it's like, oh,
Right.
it's like an elite club. And I'm like, I'm an elite club on both sides. So
Yeah.
with that, there's this narrative that you can take on of like, well, I'm not going to make it because only 50% graduate high school or only 3% graduate college.
Mm.
And what part of what I'm getting to do is now talk to foster care kids and be like, you realize you are part of that 50%. You're enrolled in school.
Mm.
That means you could be part of the
Yeah.
3% that graduate. And you want this, you
Yeah. You're
got to
flipping
do
the
it. It's
script
going to be
for them.
hard, but
Yeah.
you got to use this as a positive narrative versus negative. And
Yeah.
honestly, I think going back and looking at my own story and sitting with someone last night, um, I just looked at him and I was like, you're going to make it. You can do this. And he's like, my
Mm.
mom didn't even tell me that. And I'm like,
Wow.
ah, like heartbroken. And then I'm like
Wow.
thinking about it this morning and I'm like, how many times did someone actually look at you in the eyes? Not just like, yeah, you'll get there and walk away, but like look at you and sit with you and say, you're going to make it. You can
Wow.
do it. That is so rare. So seeing how many people have done that for me, it's like, how many more people can we just get on board to be like, hey,
Yep.
let's start looking at people and just being like, hey, I know it's hard, but you can do it if you do these things. Like just keep going
Mm.
the course.
Wow.
But
Wow.
that's just my story in a nutshell. The
Jeez.
last one is actually
Denisha.
the youngest is 19 now, so it's like I made it with all kids.
Wow.
We all grown up and we all grew up together. But
Wow.
it's been a journey.
Wow. Okay, there's a whole lot to unpack right here. I mean, this is
Yeah,
this was a
it's a
big, and I
lot.
appreciate you did such a great job of just walking us through kind of the timeline and the challenges that were presented at each one of those stages. But here's the thing, like, and I don't know if maybe you've already answered it or maybe there's more underneath it as well. But I'm hearing you say that there were so many people that looked you in the eye and said, "You're going to make this. You're going to make this," and that was
Mhm.
very pivotal for you in
Yeah.
any of our stories, whether it's big T tragedy like what I've gone through or little T trauma over the course of years and years and years that compound itself
Mhm.
or anywhere in between, resilience is a huge part of making it through, right?
Yeah.
Is hanging on to this sometimes this hope that is unfounded. It's like,
Hmm.
why would you have any hope, right? But as scripture says, do not grow weary in well doing, for at the proper time you will reap a harvest. There's so much about perseverance in scripture and long suffering. And what was it for you that gave you that kind of resilience or built that resilience? Like what kept you motivated through this entire journey? I mean, to your point, multiple times failing or staring failure in the
Hmm.
face, multiple times hearing people say you're never going to make it, you're a statistic. How did you keep pushing forward?
It honestly was the people who came around. And it's kind of funny because I'm like, okay, where was that one moment? And I don't think it was one moment or one person. It was
Yeah.
multiple people that God placed in my life. Because the day that we were taken from our home to foster care, there was a mom, and like I was like cussing out the CPS worker. I was like, I'm done with you. Like, you don't know me. I don't know you. You're a stranger. You're tearing my family apart.
Mm.
And this mom pulled me aside and she's like, honey, we don't talk to people like that. But what we do
Mm.
is we pray, and we pray because we need to just come to Jesus. And I was like, oh my gosh, and I'm
Wow.
15 at that point, and I'm just like, I don't really like
Right.
God right now because He's tearing my life apart. But she's like, I
Yeah.
don't care.
Yeah.
We're just gonna pray. And she wasn't like, pray for
Mm.
peace and get this together. She's like, God, give her strength, give her joy right now.
Mm.
And that was something where it's like, oh my goodness. And then the next time something happened, there was always someone who was like, look, I don't know. The answers were never from someone who said, you'll be fine, just get over it, or just trust God, and then they walk away.
Mm.
It was the person who sat with you and they're just like, you know what? That's some hard stuff. Can we just pray?
Yeah.
And it was
Yeah.
always that, like, I'm going to pray for strength for you. Because I would roll my eyes
Mm.
when people were like, oh, it's going to come, your blessings are coming in abundance. And I'm like, yeah, it'd be nice to thank him right now because it's hard right now.
Yeah.
But the ones that
Right.
meant the most were the people who just pulled you aside and they said, please don't give up. Like, I don't know what God's doing,
Mm.
but I want to pray strength with you. And it's God putting that fire back in, is to hear when you hear like a story of someone who says like, oh, this is what went on and then this is what happened. You're like, oh, I really hope God can use that and do that in my life. And you hope
Mm.
for that. But there is that moment where you're just like, I don't get it anymore. And every single time that happened, that's when
Yeah.
God was like, here's this person to talk to you real quick. Even if it was like, hey, I know we don't talk often, but here's something I think you need to hear. And one of those moments, I
Yeah.
think, when I had my siblings, I was like panicking because bank account was overdrawn, rent was due, and the smallest brother, who was 12, he was doing a jazz concert. And someone said, oh, he told me he needed pants. And someone came up and they're like, hey, I haven't seen you in 3 weeks. I had to come tonight because I needed to give you this. And they just handed me the money. And it was exactly what I needed to go buy his pants. And he's like, God needs you to know he sees you
Wow.
and he knows. And he goes, that's all I'm supposed to say. And he walked away. And that was, I think, every single time it's that I
Wow.
see you and I know you, and it's from God. Like, it's not people. It's like that
Yeah.
pushes me to go where it's like, okay, I might not be hearing your voice right now, Lord, but someone else is coming in and saying, I feel like God needs me to tell you that I see you and I know you. And I'm like, that's huge, because that's where I've
Yeah.
never felt seen and known my whole life. And so it's like that reminder of like,
Right.
I don't talk to you often and you really don't know my story. So how do you know that that's what I need to hear? And that's what I think, that's where the resilience comes from. And just wanting to
Yeah.
not have the past repeat itself anymore, because it's hard to watch every family member be like, yeah, we remember, CPS, or we remember your parents like this or that, or yeah, we experienced that too. And you hear it from outside friends where they're like, yeah, I got hit a few times, I had bruises, no big deal. And you're like, it's not how it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be like that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Wow. Wow. Do you feel like everybody has kind of those exit ramp type moments in their story or opportunities in their story? What I mean by that is like you're you're testifying to several different people that really help to infuse that hope into your life,
Mhm.
and you're seeing God in it, right? You have a vantage point that sees you're like, and maybe you were looking for it, maybe you weren't, but for whatever reason your propensity is like, oh, I see God there. Like,
Mhm.
oh, I see that this is a little bit of a breadcrumb of hope. Like if I just keep following this trail, then I'm gonna make it through. Do you feel like that's true for everyone, and some people just don't see it or they don't take that opportunity? Or do you feel like that's only true for a select number of people? I have my theory on it, but I
Yeah.
wonder what, in your experience, especially as you're working with other folks, who are in the foster care system and you're trying to encourage them, you've seen, I'm sure, a number of different stories, heard a number of different stories. What's your thought on that?
I think we all have the opportunity to look for the hope and to look for God. And I think
Mm,
sometimes we don't. It is easier to be someone who is negative. It is harder to find the positive. Our brain naturally remembers negative things that happen versus, like, I think it's like we can remember
yeah.
10 negative things right off the bat. Let's start looking at the good and we're like,
Right.
where is it?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's kind of hard. And I do think
Yeah.
that we do naturally, we do come back to our selfish side. And if we look in psychology, it
Mm,
actually says that we're naturally selfish people. So when we have, maybe someone listening is like, well, there's history of generational abuse in my family. And it's like they made the choices to go down that route. We have the choices to make, to go right or left. And it's up to us to take it. Now, it doesn't mean
yeah.
that right or left is going to be the greatest route to take, but at any point we can say, you know what, I'm going to continue to
Mhm.
push forward and try, even if I don't see the hope, or I'm going to just stop here. Every single person has that ability, and it's every choice we
Yeah.
make is hard, and it doesn't make it easier. But it is one
Yeah.
of those things. Is talking to a lot of foster care kids, they're just like, well, no one's wanting to help me. While they're sitting next to a caseworker who's like, I brought you here to this event to hear her speak or to hear of the resources we have, and you're just not tapping into them or you're not showing up. And it's like, in our brokenness, it is so hard to see the hope sometimes. And in the moments that we
Yeah.
feel abandoned, it is hard to see who's actually for us, because we're just in this moment of fighting or flighting. We're just like, I'm either going to fight it out or I'm going to run away. And
Right.
emotionally, when you're in that, you're not thinking of this could be good in a year. You're just kind of like, I see what's in front of me.
Right.
And
Right.
what I see in front of me is broken and I'm bruised. Like, I'm on the floor.
Mm,
I got nowhere else to go. Because
yep.
if you asked me that question 8 years ago, I would have been like, dude, I don't know. Like, I'm pretty sure like I'm
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
destined for doom. But seeing
Mm,
just a lot of people's, I think a lot of people recognize that in how I was talking, where I was just like, it's just so hopeless that they were like, okay, if you're not
yeah.
going to speak hope, I'm going to speak hope into you. And a
Mm,
friend actually said that, like, when you don't feel like praying anymore, I want you to let me know, and I'm going to pray on your behalf, and I'm going to lift you up. Now, we may not
yeah.
have those people all the time in our lives, but we can be that person for other people too. It is just so
Yeah.
hard. So it's kind of like, yes, I do think we have those choices to make. And at any point, we can get off and just be like, I'm done. I'm going to sit in my negativity, or I'm going to sit in my trauma, and I'm not going to move forward. But when we start to heal from that, it's because we're actively trying to understand, like, why does this hurt? Why does this affect me? And I'm tired of being on this road. And I think that's where I got, whereas
Yeah.
I was tired of seeing generation after generation and just so many people in my life choosing, not just my parents, but my friends' parents, choosing to be just bitter and ugly toward their kids. And then seeing that there's these other parents who were like, I will not talk to my kids like that. And you're like, there is another way. What does that look like?
Mm,
And actively
wow.
pursuing that. Um, that changes you. So when you see someone doing, you're
Yeah.
like, I want to be on this side of the road. You have to go toward those people versus going toward the people that you're like, this is not a
That's
good
good.
environment to be in.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. I mean, every one of us can probably attest to the fact that if we're at least reflective enough that we can, when we get around the right types of people, it elevates our motivation to get, to like,
Absolutely.
wow, they inspire me. Like I want to become more like and espouse the values and live out the
Mhm.
values and the virtues that it seems like those people are living out. And the alternate is true, right? Where we get around
Mhm.
negative, toxic people, we can easily slip into that, you know?
Yeah.
um very few of us are good enough to be able to like go into those toxic environments in a long standing season and be able to like pull people up out of it and be the
Yeah.
like to live out the virtues and values that we know and we want to adhere to, because it so easily creeps into our nature.
Mhm.
And so, to your point, like very clear steps that each of us can take is who do I want to be in 5 years? Well, let me get around people like
Mhm.
that, because they're
Absolutely.
going to
And that's
challenge me,
I that
right? They're going to,
absolutely goes to that saying, there's like, you're the five people you hang out with. And it's true.
that's right.
Like, you want to know who
Yeah,
you are, look at the five people around you. And if you're like, well, I hang out with kids all day, it's
absolutely.
like, but look at your attitude. Like, do you act like a child, or are
Yeah,
you showing, like, are you being the leader? And that's, I think, that
yeah,
hits hard, because sometimes you're like, I'm
mm,
not hanging around the best of people. Like, that's not good. And it's like,
yeah,
well, if they handle chaos in all of, ugly ways, that's how you may handle
right.
chaos too. So if you don't want to do it that way, you have to get around people that are different, or just have that conversation of like, hey, I don't want to do that anymore. Let's try this, and help
Right.
people grow. That is a
Right.
good
That's
point.
so good. And I love what you said, Denisha, about like we always have choice. We always have a
Mm.
choice, right?
Oh,
Our circumstances may have robbed a whole lot of things from us, but there's one thing, as Viktor Frankl talks about in Man's Search for Meaning. You're talking about this Holocaust survivor who's had everything stripped
mhm.
from him, all of his freedom stripped from him. He said in that moment, he said, there's one thing that can't be stripped from you, and that's the power to choose the
Yes.
type of attitude that you're going to exhibit in that moment. Like that's a freedom that nobody can, no matter what your
Yeah.
circumstances are surrounding you. And so it's so good to even be able to be reminded of that we all have agency. And what trauma tends to do, no matter what type of trauma, it tends to get us to believe that we no longer have agency, that we have been
Yeah.
stripped of that ability to choose what we're the decision that we're going to make now, right? And that
Absolutely.
goes back to what you were saying earlier. I love what you said. Like I can't control necessarily the outcomes. Like I don't
Hmm.
know where my life's going to be in 5 years, but I can control the decision I make today. And
Hmm.
I can at least, presuppose that this decision will probably put me a little bit closer to the outcome that I want for my life. But
Right.
the only thing I can control right now is this decision right here. And I can
Yeah.
be proud of this decision right here.
Yeah. And I think that that's like when my professor said, like, ask yourself, if you wake up in 10 years, are you going to be happy with those choices? Someone asked me, they're like, I have a question. 10 years after, did you wake up happy with your choices? And I
Mm,
did. And I wasn't like, that was when
mm,
my life was like falling apart. And like I had the kids in the apartment, I'm laying on
yeah.
the floor and I'm like, am I happy with my choices? And I'm like, I am happy with my choices. I'm not where I want
Wow.
to be yet, but I'm happy with those choices that
Right.
I've made to land me here. And I think sometimes we hear that
Wow.
saying and we're like, well, I'm not happy with being here. It's like you don't have to be happy with where you've landed, but you have a choice to change that or not. And maybe you're not happy right now. Maybe that's one of the choices you need to make is counseling, because you're just like, you know what? I realize I'm just not a happy person. That's a choice that you have. You have
Right.
a choice to be happy or not. And it's not, I feel like sometimes we look at the situation and we're like, well, it's not like that person's happiness or this person's happiness. And like for me, I don't want to put my life on a mirror towards somebody else. Like I want it to look unique in what God made it for.
Yeah.
You know, my life is very different.
Yeah.
I've never felt like my life has
That's so
matched
good.
anybody that I've been around. But if I want to be
I
happy
certainly
with
have
a
never heard a
person,
story like yours.
like it's very crazy, because it's not like, I feel like that's not all of it. Like there's so much damage and horrible stuff that's happened, but God's like, here, I'm going to flip this for you. But
Mm,
it felt like it's taken so long. And I think that's where we like, well, I made the choice and I made the choice yesterday and it needs to fix now. I made the choice a year ago and it's still not changing. And I'm like, then what choice do we have to
yeah.
make now? And that's where I always have had to reevaluate those choices to be like, okay, for example, do I still hang out with that friend who talks horrible about their spouse? Like, no, I'm actually going to be like, you
Mm,
know what? We're going to have a conversation real quick to say, I don't talk about my spouse that way. I'm going to let you know. And like, I will be leaving the
yeah.
room once you start doing that. There's this choice
Yeah.
of where we work. And I think sometimes we're like, well, we're called to do these specific things. And I'm like, you are, but God is not confined to a building or a space or a job. Like he just wants us to make choices to follow him. Like, I don't think he's like, well, I need you to work at this specific place. And if you leave, I'm disappointed in you. And I'm like, that's not what he
Yeah.
does. Like,
Right.
he's
Right.
just like, go spread my name.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, whatever environment that's in for as ever long as it's supposed to
Yeah.
be. But he's just, we're not supposed to be living in this brokenness all the time. This
Yeah.
is a sinful world, but we don't have to live in that brokenheartedness all the time. And I think that that's
Mm,
why Paul's story is so crazy, is when he's talking to everybody, he's like, hey, I'm in jail, but I'm still
yeah.
I'm still doing what I was supposed to do. If I
Right.
wasn't doing what I was supposed to do, I wouldn't be here. And you're just like,
Right.
huh, like, okay,
Right.
sometimes our doing things for Jesus doesn't look like freedom and
Yeah.
feeling great and money. It might actually be prison sales and like being able to say, hey, I'm actually being able to speak to this person because of that brokenness that I'm in or this captivity that I'm in. And you're like, huh,
Mm,
interesting.
yeah.
But
That's
we have
so
choices.
good. That's so good. Yeah. And, to your point, is Paul saying, hey, I want you to understand this is all happening to me for the advancement of the gospel,
Yeah.
right? If it wasn't for the resurrection, all of this would be futile and meaningless, right? But because we live on the other side of the resurrection, we can know that no matter what our circumstances tell us today, that's not the end of the story. And that
Right.
we can live out a different story.
Mm.
We can live a resurrection. We don't have to, like you said, we don't have to live in the brokenheartedness. Yes, we live in a broken world, okay? And we won't fully and finally realize the redemption of Christ until Jesus comes back. He makes all things right, right? And he like
Right.
sets everything right. He completely and finally terminates evil and sin and darkness and all of those. But right now we can live in light of the resurrection, that we too
Mm.
can stand up out of our circumstances by the power of the Holy Spirit, and we can move forward and then help other people in that. And that's what you're doing, is
Yeah.
you're not just walking out of, through and out of your circumstances, but you're helping other people in those circumstances as well. And I'm sure that's bringing some added layers of meaning and purpose to your story, maybe even some healing. Can you talk about
Hmm.
that a little bit? Like, how's that? I mean, it wasn't even just now. It was
Yeah.
like when you were helping your siblings, you're helping your siblings out in the midst of all of it, right? But that had to
Yeah.
have done something for you because you're living out a life of meaning.
I think there's there's a lot to that to unpack. And I think one of the things I think of in my head is, when we've come out of the fire, a lot of the times we're like, we're done, we did it. But when we reach back into the
Yeah.
fire and pick the other people out and say it's this way, um, it just changes what the fire actually is. And that's a weird thing to think of, where it's like,
Mm.
okay, my how I grew up was
No, unpack that
crazy.
a little bit more. That's
Yeah,
really good.
because it's like weird. But when you
Yeah.
like the way that we grew up, I could have made it out and been like, peace out. I'm never talking to my family again. But at 19,
Mm.
I was like, I need to get my life ready so that if in case my siblings need me in any way, I'm ready to take them in. And that drove me for a
Mm.
really long time. And then it happened. And I was like, why did I have that thought at 19? And it's that thought of, okay, but I'm reaching back in the fire to say, guys, it's this way. We do not have to continue down in this path. We don't have to sit here. We can leave. And
Wow.
that is now what I'm getting to do with foster care students, is going in and foster care parents being like, yes, this is a hard mission field, but it is a mission field that needs people to point back and say, hey guys, it's this way. Getting out is this way. You want to break generational
Wow.
cycles? It's this way. You don't want to be an alcoholic. Did you also know that you don't have to drink, but also you can learn how to control drinking? Like, just because your parent did it didn't mean that you did it. Just go. Like, this is the way.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of people wanting to reach back in the fire, because I think it's hard, because you need a strength. You need to have a strength of like, okay, I can go into this environment, talk about it, and leave and not be damaged. That's where healing has to
Yeah.
come in. So you can't always go back into old circumstances and situations like what you went through without that healing first. It's really hard.
That's good.
Sometimes that comes along the way when you're working
Yeah.
like with one or two people. But there was a country singer who said it is like, she's like on tour right now, but she was like, I used to show up where there was three people in the room to sing to. And now she's showing up to sing into auditoriums of thousands and thousands of people.
Right.
She's like, you can't get to that thousands of people unless you're with the three first. And I think that that's our whole thing. Like,
Wow.
you can't impact a world of people if you haven't healed first. But you can still
Yeah.
impact one life. You can still help one person. And if there's 30 people in the room or 1,000 people in the room and I'm sharing my story, my goal is not to speak to 1,000 people. I'm not there to be like, I want an auditorium full of people. If that happens, cool. But I don't care if one person shows up. If that one person shows up, that is where
Mm.
God's saying, I need you to talk to this one person, because that one person, maybe
Yeah.
they're the ones to go change the world. Maybe I'm going to use
Wow.
them to go impact the thousands. So if I'm not willing to first heal and then reach back into the fire, there's not much, like, it just becomes like, oh yeah, that's my past life. Like, I have a choice of
Yeah.
running away
Right.
or going back and being like, guys, this is the way out. And I think that's why our country has such a hard epidemic of mental and emotional, just depression, anxiety. Abuse is so prevalent. Foster care is so big. There's over
Yeah.
400,000 kids in foster care right now. And really, what a lot of it goes back to is people are not willing to come back and be like, hey, guys, this is the way out. So generational cycles keep
Wow.
happening. And it's not the same parents, it's their kids doing the
Yeah.
same things. And that's heartbreaking to
Yeah.
me. So it's risk going back and being like, oh, this hurt a little bit to share my story. But then there is that healing that comes where it's not even, half the time it's not like, oh, I'm so healed because I shared my story. It's more of someone sharing their story with me and being like, man, you're resilient. And it's no longer about me. It's about
Yeah.
them, and being like, I'm here to be
Yeah.
that person to say, I get it, but now I'm going to speak back into you, and just remind you
Yep.
that you can. And that is hard, but you can do this.
Mm.
So it's been healing to hear other people's stories, because it reminds me that I'm not alone, but it's also more about me listening and learning from them versus me being like, I have all this wisdom to give you, because
Yeah.
I don't feel like I
Yeah.
do. I don't, like, I know, yes, I have a similar
Yeah.
story to them and I'm on the other side, but I remember being that 15-year-old girl who's like, I don't care if you're on the other
Mm.
side. You just don't get it. You don't get what I've gone through.
Wow. Wow. Phew. That's interesting. That's really interesting. So even though you have gone through it, there's still some of that, like, you just don't quite get it because you're not in it
Mhm.
anymore. And so
Yeah.
as you immerse yourself into it, you're able to, You're able to walk with a little bit more empathy because you're immersing yourself back into it, and yet you're immersing yourself back into it with you're in a different way. You're carrying yourself differently. You have a different life. You're coming in and being light in those moments right there. And really, we all need, every one of us in our journey, we need someone to come and tell us, hey, it's not always going to feel this way. You're not
Yeah.
always going to have this circumstance that's going to be so overwhelming. You can get through this by the power of the Holy Spirit. You can walk through this. And I think that's why Jesus doesn't just heal us from things. He heals us for things. He doesn't just like heal us so we're now out of it and we don't have to go back and touch it anymore. He heals us for us being able to go back and reach back, like you said, into the fire and bring people through ourselves. And while there may need to be a latency period in between for you to really get some healing, you know, and you referenced Paul earlier. Paul even had that. Paul had some time where he had to get completely out of being immersed in this, you know, Pharisaical persecution type circles. And he had to go and really hear from the Lord for years before he went back into those circles to minister to people. But while that may be the case, don't forget about where you came from and the type of people that need to hear from you so they can also experience healing.
Absolutely. And it's kind of, I've used this saying before, but there's times where you're sitting there listening to someone at church or on the radio or maybe a conference, and they're like, you know, stubbed my toe once and that just destroyed my life. And you're just like, dude, you don't get it. But when that person comes up and they're like, hey, I have lost everything. I have had to rebuild my life. I have had to do it alone. You're just like, I need to talk to you. Like, we need to have a conversation. And that's the person who changes your perception on things, because it's not a stubbed toe. Like, you can't equate a stubbed toe to losing your family. You can't. It's two different things.
Yeah.
But if you are able to say, you know what, I have lost my family, maybe not in that way, but in this way, that's more relatable to that person. And so sometimes we need to be able to be open and not, you know, relate it to a stubbed toe like I've heard of. And I'm just like, I don't want to talk to that person. I'm going to leave because that was really petty. Like, I'm so sorry your toe hurts. But that person who comes in and they're just like, I'm going to bear it all. Not to relive, not to hash out the actual details of it, but to say, this is what I went through and this is what I've learned. And I hope to share that with you to encourage you that you can still do great things. Doesn't matter what your age is. It doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter what the past is. It can be redeemed. And I think what I've been seeing a lot lately is that God is just like, hey, by the way, you're not replaceable. You're not invisible, but I've had you wait. And this is like that moment of waiting to start sharing your story. And it wasn't from finishing the degree, but it was from writing from Foster to PhD, of how I was able to connect with these groups to be like, hey, here's this book that they could read. And it's an accomplishment, but every single person says the same. It's not really the degree. Yes, the degree is great. And I don't want to underplay that, but it's the story behind it. And that's what these kids need to hear, is that story behind it. And that's just like, that makes sense. But there's a lot that God is still doing that I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm still shocked. I'm like, okay, this is new, because I've never had like.
And you will continually.
Yeah.
That's right.
Like,
You'll continually be shocked. You'll continually, this is a new adventure. This is something that God is continuing to unfold. And as you step into these spaces, he's going to keep showing you more and more. More and more of his redemption story, you know, like you understand it to an extent, and you've been able to pin this now in this book, you know, from Foster to PhD, letters from a suitcase, which, by the way, we'll put in the show notes. Make sure everybody picks up a copy of this. But you've been able to see kind of the redemption story in it, but it's going to keep unfolding. It's going to keep, that's what I love about God, is that he's continually showing us more and more of how he's redeeming our story and how he's using it. But he only does that as we are stepping into reaching back into the fire and helping other people. Right.
Absolutely. And it's crazy too, because it's like you're saying, like, there's going to be more of those moments. And one of those moments is, so we're actually pregnant. So it's pretty fun. We're in week 15.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. We had a miscarriage before, but also it was like when I was 19, I was like, I'm never going to be a parent because I'm going to be a horrible parent. And that was hard. Like that was a hard thing. And people are like, no, you just need to meet the right person, or like, oh, you just need to get over it. Or it was just that. So I was so broken that even seeing a family of my own, I was like, it's just not in the cards for me because of how
Yeah.
my family has been generationally divorces, all of, CPS, abuse, multiple children
Yeah.
from multiple women or men and whatever. Like it's crazy when you
Yeah.
start to look at the details of your family and then God's like, hold on, like he's going to redeem everything. And so being on this side, I was
Right.
sitting back a little bit and being like, I'm a little surprised that I'm so excited because it's like, I'm like, oh, we're going to do this with her. And like, we're going to do that with her. And like, we're going to do, I'm going to love being a mom. And I'm like, that was not me at 19. Being 32 from the
Mm.
healing, making mistakes with my siblings and probably losing
Yeah.
my cool too much. It's just like, yeah, it's part of parenting. Like that chilled me out a little bit, but now being excited about
Yeah.
that new adventure to be like, let's see what she gets to do in her life. That is something that
Mm.
I had never thought would happen because of how broken I was at 19. It had
Yeah.
nothing to do with me being like, oh, let me find a spouse or anything like that. It was just because I had seen how my parents raised children and how other parents were. I thought that was the only way. And I'm like, I'm not going to do that to a kid. Like, that
Yeah.
kid doesn't deserve that.
Yeah.
But like, God's like, hey, by the way, like, I've brought people into your
Mm.
life to show you what good parenting is. Parenting is hard, but I'm going to show you that it does not have to be
Yeah.
that way. And I'm like, oh, so it's like and it's, in 5 years, I'm gonna be like, there's this other thing that he revealed, and I'm gonna be like, oh my gosh, because that's just he does that for us, and I think that's crazy and amazing. And sometimes we have to
Yeah.
just sit back and look back and be like, okay, God, what have you showed me already? What have you done for me already? Like, what have I missed? And I think one of the pastors
Yeah.
that it was one of the churches I went to. He said, it's really easy to look at the situation that you're in and say God's not here, and then be years later be like, this is where God was. But if you can get to a point in your life to say, this is where
Yeah.
God is right now in this moment, I see his hand moving. That's just a beautiful thing to be able to do. And so instead of being like, God, I need you to show up, it's just like, God, show me where you're at today. Show me your hand. Show me your peace.
Yeah.
Show me your mercy. And every time I would pray that, like a song would come on the radio where it was just like, I hear you, I see
Mm.
you, and I know you. And I'm like, well, I can't hear your voice, but here's a song. Or I'd open the Bible and it was like, okay, we're at Wednesday Bible study or Sunday church, and all of a
Right.
sudden they're talking about how I feel, and I'm like, I haven't told you how I felt, so I know this message was not for me, but also it
Wow.
is for me. So it's like God does that within situations. So if we're able to look in our pain and just be like, God, show me your
Yeah.
hand, show me where you're at, show me your peace, versus like, God, you're not here, I hate you. We'll be able to see his hand moving a little bit more. And it takes time, and just
Yeah.
even the littlest things can be hope. And there's always been a butterfly that
Yeah.
resembles that for me. And there's been times where I'm walking and I'm like, I don't hear you. Can I see your
Mm.
hand? And butterflies don't really exist where I live. And so seeing one, you're like,
Wow.
huh, that's not a moth. That is a butterfly.
Oh.
Okay. And
Wow.
it shocks
Wow.
you when you have those moments, but it's neat
Yeah.
to see when God's like, hey, I'm here. I hear you. I'm listening.
Yeah, that's
And
great.
sometimes it's just, I'm not listening to him. So guilty.
Yeah. Yep. That's right. That's right. Well, Denisha, let's say, I mean, as we kind of like close down the conversation, I really want to make sure that, I mean, as the church, right, the Big C church, we're very uninformed a lot of times about the foster care system, and we also are we're not as involved as what I think we should be as the
Mhm.
church, right? We have a lot of other missions that we're involved in, but that's a major mission field that we should be more involved in, I think, as local. And I hear about local churches that are doing really cool stuff with foster care, and it's great, it's awesome. But I wonder if you're like, let's say you're speaking to a church right now and you're trying to implore the body of Christ, hey, here's how you should intervene. You have such a great story of people who were just walking beside you, intervening all along the way, being the hands and feet of Jesus. What would you say? How would you kind of, as you're sending us off in some ways, how would you implore the body of Christ to step into the mess of the foster care system and really be the hands and feet of Jesus?
there is so much to do, but I think the biggest thing that we need to do is take kids more seriously. Sometimes they'll open up about their stories and they're told that they're liars. I know that happened to me and my siblings several times. They sided with my
Mm,
parents or they would believe my parents more. And it didn't matter how many bruises you showed or how much you could prove it. They were just like, no, like you got to listen to your parents. You got to submit to your parents. You got to honor your parents. So I think first off, stopping then the notion of I'm just going to ignore you because you're the child, and understanding that if a child is telling you their brokenness, you do need to take it seriously and you need to
yeah.
look into it. I think sometimes what will happen is some people in churches, they don't know how to handle that situation. So it's like you really need to go to CPS and talk to them. Like, what can we do? How can we help? The county has a great service department, and they're all counties are trying to get connected with more partners. And
Yeah.
the biggest need is for backpacks and luggage bags. When I
Okay.
was picked up from with foster care, I was given a grocery sack, one of the flimsy old ones, and was told you have 5 minutes to go get clothes, and that you
Wow.
can't carry a lot in a little grocery bag. Other kids will get trash bags. Sometimes they won't. They'll get a little bin that's in their house. It's what's really in the home of the family.
Yeah.
Um, the big reason that people get taken away is because of neglect and abuse. So it's understanding is
Yeah.
like, how can we as the church start helping these families not hide it, but help them, getting them parenting classes, getting them the babysitting that they
Yeah.
need. Sometimes it's the parents off for 3 days for working, gets home and then leaves again, and then they have no one watching the kids. Be the people who can say, I can babysit for free for families that might
Yeah.
not have that money. And then coming alongside teenagers, because the teenagers are, they need to be protected and loved and shown that they are valued in the community.
Yeah.
It's really hard because everyone focuses on little kids, and then teenagers, it's kind of like whatever, and then they age out and then they leave the church. And church hurt is very real
Right.
and very heartbreaking. And I know for myself, the abuse that I went through was also spiritual abuse. And if people don't know what that is, it's just using the Bible or God against you to say, like, you're a horrible human, God hates you, or here's this verse where I'm telling you to obey and I'm going to still abuse you.
Mm,
And there are a lot of
wow.
kids who are still experiencing that. So if the church can be a voice of
Yeah.
reason and help, is that they hear, maybe they hear someone where it's like, hey, this family is taking in kids from foster care. Call that family. What do you guys need? Do you guys need dinner the next week? How
Yeah.
can we love on these kids? How can we make sure that they're leaving with clothes? Because you really don't leave with much of what's in your house. You live with just what's on your back. And these kids can be moved around a lot.
Right.
So even if you there, it's kind of like being like a teacher mindset where it's like, even if you're in my classroom for a week, I'm going to love on you as if I have a year with you. Just loving those kids, even if those kids are only with you for a week at church, love on that kid fiercely because you might be the only positive light in their life right now. So there's so much to do, but I think starting with the
Yeah.
county, they can direct each person to say, here's what we need. Sometimes it might be financial assistance. Sometimes it might just be, we need backpacks and clothes, and or just people showing up to be willing to take kids in that are teenagers.
Yeah.
There's so much to
Yeah.
do.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, that's so good. No, that's it's so helpful too. Just very, very helpful, practical ways that we can get involved because sometimes we presume that we know the needs or we presume, oh, this is how it's going to help. But of course, the
Right.
old adage, when helping hurts, or
Yeah.
if we're not really in it, we've got to immerse ourselves in it. We've got to be able to build a sense of empathy and walk beside folks who are hurting in in any realm, any sector of society before
Yeah.
we can really intuitively know what the needs are. And so it's very helpful for you to be able to share that with us. And I'm just sharing your story, Denisha. I mean, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and with your vulnerability and sharing with us what you've journeyed through, how God has brought you through this, and then just your passion. I'm inspired by your heart and your passion for reaching back into the fire. I'm going to keep using that language that you used right there because you're reaching back into the fire and you're bringing people through it as well. And I can see it all over your face. I can hear it all over your voice, and God's going to use you and continue to use you in really, really big, monumental ways in this space. So, thanks for spending time with us. I want to again make sure that everybody picks up this book From Foster to PhD. I'm sure that you only shared a little bit of all of the
Yeah.
complexity of your story that you now share in this book, From
Mhm.
Foster to PhD, Letters from a Suitcase. We'll put the link right there in the show notes so everybody can pick that up. In fact, maybe we'll even convince Danisha to send us a copy so we can do a free giveaway as well.
Yes, I'll send that to you guys.
And
Yeah.
so we're just, yeah, we'll get that connected. And so you guys can follow us on Instagram. You'll see where we'll be giving away a copy of that book. But Danisha, thank you so much for spending time with us. Thank you for your heart and what you're doing. It's just been an honor to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.